Have you ever wondered what a lie smells like, or what kind of sound the absolute truth makes when it shatters the foundation of your world, not with a roar, but with a whisper and the gentle clatter of a tin cup? I am old now, and the clarity of youth has long faded, replaced by the persistent, heavy gray of memory. But there was a time long ago when my entire existence was devoted to clarity. Before the end, I was a girl of the searchlights, a Flakwaffenhelferin. My duty was to stand in the cold, wet German night, staring into the infinite black sky, and when the sirens wailed their terrible warning. My job was to find them, to cut the darkness with a beam so fierce, so blindingly pure, that the enemy aircraft had nowhere left to hide. I was trained to see sharp edges, to distinguish the friendly darkness from the hostile intruder. My whole world was light versus black, us versus them, good versus evil. It was simple. It had to be simple, or how could you bear the screaming in the ruins? I volunteered at 18, you see. Fierce, frightened, patriotic. My older brother, Gunther, had frozen into the mud of the East, and my fury became my fuel. The enemy was a monster, a barbarian, an annihilator. The state told us this. The papers scrimed it. The bombs confirmed it, night after punishing night, turning the streets I knew into lakes of fire and dust. I saw it with my own eyes. The total, calculated destruction of my homeland. And so I clung to the light, to the clarity of the beam, knowing that we were the righteous few, defending what was sacred against the relentless, subhuman tide. This belief, this fortress of conviction, was all that kept the shivering from becoming despair. It was the only thing I had left to protect. Even now, the smell of damp stone mixed with industrial-strength disinfectant and the strange, sickly sweet scent of real American coffee can pull me back to that day. Not as a ghost, but as a young woman stepping back into a cold, unfamiliar room. The processing center, a repurposed French schoolhouse, somewhere in the confusion of the collapsing front. It was the air itself that was wrong. The air was too clean, too still. After weeks of gunpowder and fear and the pervasive stench of human desperation, this place was sterile. It wasn't unnerving, organized quiet. I had been prepared for hell. I had braced myself for the confirming act of brutality that would justify every sacrifice, every hatred, every single moment of the last 4 years. I expected the kicks, the spitting, the humiliation. I expected the shouts in a guttural, vengeful tongue. I had rehearsed my silence, my defiant stare, the unyielding rigidity of my spine. I would give them nothing. I would be a fortress of spite. I would confirm their monstrosity in my endurance. This was the final battle of my spirit. They stripped me. Of course. Disinfecting chemicals stung my cracked skin. They issued me a rough gray uniform that hung like a shroud on my starved frame. Then shivering, not just from the cold, but from the shock of sudden, overwhelming safety, a safety that felt more like a cage, I was directed to a cot in the vast, echoing gymnasium. Rows of them klein, meticulously spaced. The order was the first terror. Where was the chaos of the beast? I sat down, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, trying to control the tremors. My eyes, trained by the searchlight to scan the darkness, now scanned the faces of my captors, looking for the telltale signs of cruelty. They were everywhere. Young men in unfamiliar, olive green wool, their movements efficient, almost bored. Not the enraged, barbaric demons of the propaganda. Just tired, organized soldiers doing a job. The scratch of a pen on paper, the distant clatter of metal mess kits, these were the sounds of my defeat. Then he appeared, Private Miller. I did not learn his name until much later, but his image is burned into the landscape of my soul. He was young, too young, barely a man with ears that stuck out slightly and eyes that were wide, a pale, shocking blue. He wasn't one of the interrogators. He wore a Red Cross armband. Medical Corps, I realized dimly. He saw me alone in the corner. I must have looked like a monument of exhaustion and fear, my face a blank mask of defiance. He walked toward me slowly, carrying something, every muscle in my body coiled. Here it comes, I thought. The trick, the prelude to the pain. My breath caught in my throat. I stared past his shoulder, refusing to meet his eyes, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of my terror. He stopped just shy of my personal space, and without a word, without any demand, any judgment, or even a hint of suspicion, he did two things that dismantled the entire architecture of my beliefs. First, he unfolded a blanket. Not the rough gray one already on the cot, but a second one. Plain, thick wool, a startling, comforting weight. He did not throw it. He draped it, gently, carefully, over my shoulders. The warmth was immediate, a physical shock against the icy numbness of my skin, and the scent was clean, like rain and fresh wool. Not like disinfectant and death. Then he extended his other hand. In it was a steaming tin mug and a piece of bread. Plain white bread, fresh enough that I could smell the yeast and the faint sweetness. The mug was full of a dark liquid that smelled faintly of spice and milk. Lies asterisk. My mind screamed. It's a ploy. Poison. A humiliation. He spoke. Not in the sharp, clipped English I expected, but in hesitant, soft German. Stilted, clearly practiced, but unmistakably kind. Bit. Warm. Essen. Plays. Warm. Light. His gaze was not judging. It was not triumphant. It was quiet, almost sad, filled with a deep, weary concern that looked utterly incongruous on the face of an enemy soldier. It was the look of one human being seeing the profound suffering of another, and simply wanting it to stop. The mug was heavy in my hand. I stared at the tea, real tea, milky and sweet. The bread was soft. I had been eating sawdust bread and ersatz coffee for 3 years. This small, unbidden act of comfort, this absurd, unnecessary kindness from the hands of a man I was conditioned to believe was a soulless destroyer, was a grenade thrown into my bunker. My mind went to war with itself. The propaganda was a shield. It was the only way I could live with the reality of the war, the deaths of my friends, Gunther's sacrifice. If they were beasts, then we were heroes. If they were barbarians, then our cause was righteous. But this man, this Private Miller with his kind eyes and his soft voice, this man was not a beast. He was just a boy who had seen my exhaustion and offered me warmth and food. I couldn't move. My hand trembled, but not from the cold now. It was the tremor of a spirit tearing itself in two. To accept the tea was to acknowledge the humanity of the enemy. To acknowledge his humanity was to admit that perhaps, just perhaps, the monsters were not only on the other side. The silence stretched. He did not press me. He did not demand gratitude. He simply stood there, waiting with a patience that was utterly disarming. Finally, the sheer, animal need for warmth and nourishment overcame the years of ideological fortification. I lifted the mug to my lips. The tea was impossibly sweet. It was the taste of peace, the taste of a normal life I had forgotten existed. It was the taste of a lie. Or was it the taste of truth? I looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. They were still just quiet, blue, and concerned. He saw me drink, and a tiny, almost imperceptible shift occurred on his face. Not a smile of triumph, but a faint, gentle easing of his own tension. Then he simply nodded, turned, and walked away, disappearing back into the hum of the Allied machine, leaving me clutching the mug and the wool blanket. I spent the next 2 days watching the world through a crack. I watched the other soldiers. They were rough, yes, but they joked with each other. They smoked their strange, strong cigarettes. They ate their food. They were bored. They were tired. They were men, not demons, not the caricatures of the posters. They were just men in a different uniform, far from home, relieved that the fighting had stopped. One afternoon, Private Miller walked past the rows of cots again, checking on a sick prisoner down the line. As he passed me, his eyes flicked toward mine. I still wore the uniform of the enemy. I still carried the pride of my defeated nation. He knew who I was, and yet his gaze was neither accusatory nor patronizing. It was simply human, a flash of recognition, and in that moment I made the choice. It was small, it was involuntary, but it was everything. I gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a movement of barely an inch, a silent acknowledgement of the blanket, the tea, and the sheer, devastating burden of his kindness. He nodded back, a slow, gentle movement, and for the first time in years, the crushing weight of duty lifted, replaced by the terrifying, fragile burden of seeing clearly. That night, lying on the rough cot, the heavy wool blanket pulled tight, I wept. Not from fear and not from despair over our defeat, but from the sudden, agonizing disorientation of realizing the world I had built my life upon was not real. The quiet of the gymnasium, broken only by the drip of a faucet and the distant, foreign murmur of English voices, was the sound of my fortress crumbling. The war had ended for me, not with the surrender of the nation, but with the quiet, terrifying unraveling of every certainty I had held dear. I am a very old woman now. I spent the rest of my life watching the sky, though not for planes. I watched it for truths. I was trained to use the searchlight to define the enemy, to burn away the darkness and find the sharp outline of the threat. But that day in that cold schoolhouse, Private Miller's small act taught me that the clearest light in the world is the one that diffuses, that softens the edges, that shows you the person underneath the uniform, under the fear, under the hatred. The black and white world I defended, the clarity I prized, was the real lie. The truth is always gray, always complicated, always uncomfortable. It smells like damp wool and sweet tea, and it tastes like the unbearable realization that the person you have been taught to hate is capable of profound, simple kindness. I never saw Private Miller again after that week. I do not know what became of him, but I owe him a debt I can never repay. For he was the first person to show me that the greatest act of courage is not to fight for what you believe, but to allow your belief to be broken when a deeper, more necessary truth presents itself. History is not a story of monsters and heroes. It is a tragedy of human beings on all sides, fighting for their piece of the darkness, forgetting the simple, terrifying truth. The man opposite you, the enemy, is just as capable of pain, just as deserving of warmth, and just as human as you are. The scar of that day is not the loss of the war, but the gain of that agonizing truth. And even now, when I feel the first chill of a coming rain, I reach for a blanket, and I remember the quiet terror of realizing that the kindest hand in my life belonged to the man I was sworn to destroy. May we all be brave enough, when the moment comes, to accept the warmth from the hand of our perceived enemy and find the courage to let our fortress fall. It is the only way the light truly wins.